All right, what's up, guys? Just wanted to make a quick video here about my ownership for the Byron Nelson this week. So you're looking at my ownership chart. I have 100 lineups in the DraftKings $3 Birdie. Great structure this week. It was very top heavy last week, so I dialed back to 80 lineups. I'm back up to 100 this week. I think this is a much better spot for me. So let's talk about some of these guys. It is a very you know thin field. There are not a lot of good players. I think only 14 of the world's top 50 are playing this, and you'll kind of see how that impacted the lineups that I created. So let's just start at the top here. Jordan Spieth, I have 21% of. I'm not sure what we're getting out of Jordan Spieth right now. Again, similar in what I did with Rory last week with hedging him. This is kind of a hedge on Spieth as well, and I think we're going to be a little heavy on him. I suspect his ownership is probably down in the 10 to 15% range, especially with how popular I think Dustin Johnson is going to be. So we'll talk about him in a second. So I'm thinking we're going to have probably a little more of Jordan Spieth than others, which I think is going to be okay. Dustin Johnson. If you would have asked me on Monday, I would have told you I'd have 100% exposure to Dustin Johnson. There's nothing not to love about him. He's got the distance. He's 10 for 10 on cuts made. Has great course history here. But when you're starting to create lineups, the idea of having him in 100% just goes out the window. He's 11,900. So when I actually started putting lineups together, I couldn't make 100 lineups that I was comfortable with. So I had to dial back a little bit. He's down to 46%, which I assume is going to be more than the rest of the field, I imagine. Dustin Johnson's probably going to be 25, 30% owned. So I have this kind of philosophy where basically, in GPPs, I'd prefer to be contrarian. But when you're putting in as many lineups as 100 or 50 or 100, which is probably more lineups than the field is putting in, then I think it's okay to be extra chalky. So if I can explain that, if I had one lineup in here in this tournament, I would not play Dustin Johnson. If I had three, I probably wouldn't play Dustin Johnson. But at some point, I'm going to have more entries than the average player in the field, and I certainly think 100 is significantly more than the average person has in a GPP. So what you can kind of do is you can almost go a little bit too chalky, out chalk them to death essentially, where you just take so much of a guy who's in such good shape that you can boost a lot of your lineup. So I think that's kind of the strategy that I'm rolling with here. I know he's going to be heavily owned. I'm taking more than that. On purpose, and it's because I have so many lineups in here. So that's the long-winded version of that. Just to kind of look through a couple more of these guys here. I like Louis. I like Brooks. Louis I think is a pretty good dark horse, and Brooks is a guy who can just hit the long ball, which is going to come in handy here. Ryan Palmer, another guy I would have loved to have 100% of. It's a really volatile strategy, but I absolutely love Ryan Palmer this week. I talked about him a ton, so I'm now backing that. With how much I love him, I'm putting my money there. Woodland DeChambeau, I think, is okay. I think Bryson is probably underpriced this week. He's probably better than a lot of the field, even though he's missed 2 straight cuts. I think his ownership will be significantly lower because he has missed 2 straight cuts. So if he checks in at like 10% owned, and I have 25% more of Bryson than the field, I'll be pretty cool with that. I think Graham DeLette is worth talking about here. So I have 43% of him, which it's a lot. And he missed the cut, and then he finished like basically dead last after making the cut in his last 2 tournaments. But to me, Graham DeLette he's the poor man's Jason Day. They both have a similar skill set. Obviously, Jason Day is on a whole nother level. It's like Graham DeLette on steroids is what Jason Day is. But they're both very similar. They both hit the ball a long way. They're both very good with their irons. They're both these sneaky kind of guys who get around and score on par 4s. In fact, Graham DeLette, excellent scoring on par 4s, which is going to come in handy on this par 70 course. Really good proximity numbers. He hits a ton of greens. So Graham DeLette is a guy who fits this course really well. I think he's going to be overlooked, and I know for a fact nobody's going to have 43% of him. So he's kind of the guy that would be a really big cut. Like if I could handpick one guy to win this, it's probably Graham DeLette, because I'm assuming I'm going to have so much more of him than the rest of the field. So I really like the way he stacks up, especially at this tournament. I think he was T22 last year, and then 2 top 10s in the previous 2 years before that. So he has a good track record here as well. I'm backing the guy. We'll see. I like him. And then finally, I'll go all the way down to the bottom, because this is something I think that's worth mentioning, because I don't do it very often. I have a guy who is essentially min-priced. He's the lowest priced golfer out here. I have 22 shares of him, which is 22% of my 100 lineups, and it's Will Zalatoris, who I don't claim to know a lot about this guy, but what I know I like about him. He is from Plano, Texas, which is like 20 miles from where this tournament is being played. He's the Texas amateur. He's won three amateur championships this year. He's currently I believe a sophomore at Wake Forest. Really good player. This is not his first PGA Tour event, which I think helps. He played the Northern Trust last year, so I think, maybe you get the butterflies out of the way at his first event. Now he can kind of come up and play in his home region at a course he's probably pretty familiar with, or at least a type of course that he's familiar with, and put on a decent showing. But rostering him was almost necessary to get as much of Dustin Johnson as I wanted. And especially I have 21 shares of Jordan Spieth, 40-something of Dustin. That's 60% of the 2 highest owned guys. I really had to make some concessions down lower on the list, and I was able to find a guy who I thought would be a decent fit, a guy who, he doesn't have to play for the money. He's an amateur. He can't make any money. He's kind of, I'm hoping, playing pretty loose and free out there this week. He fits the mold of that type of flyer of a player that I'm looking for. So 22% of him, I just hope he makes the cut. Honestly, I don't expect anything more. If he makes the cut, if he finishes like 65th, cool, because that'll be very helpful for me. But yeah, that's it. So back to 100 lineups. This is my full sheet here, and it has all the lineups that I'm rolling out and all of my ownership. So I'll tweet this out. So follow me on Twitter. It's at DFS on demand. I'll tweet it out. You can take a look at this yourself and follow along, and maybe we'll win this thing. All right, best of luck, and I'll talk to you guys soon. See ya.